Hey guys, it's Nate. Today we're going to be diving into part 2 of the Epoxy River Desk project. When we first took our project out of the melamine form, we realized that there was a bunch of excess epoxy on it. So in order to combat that, we took it over to our friend's shop that had a drum sander which allows large area to be sanded off at one time, and it saved us a lot of time and effort from doing it all by hand. Our friend's sander is an open-end sander, and what that means is that it's not totally enclosed on both sides, so you're able to have a portion of your project hanging out the side if it's oversized. So while individually when we ran the project through the sander, it wouldn't cover the whole project, when we were able to flip it, we could do the other side and then actually, by doing 2 run-throughs, cover the full project width. So I think our project was just under 32 inches. The drum sander had a 19-inch working diameter, so by flipping it, it covers a total distance of 38 inches. So our 32-inch project was able to be fully sanded by doing 2 run-throughs. However, that did mean that we needed to do a total of 4 different run-throughs, 2 top and 2 bottom, to get both of the sides flat. So while the drum sander did a really good job at getting both sides really flat, just because of how wide our project was, it did take us a good deal of time to get all 4 planes that we needed to run through, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, to get both sides flat. So a drum sander works by having a traction belt underneath and then a sanding drum component that has a wheel that sandpaper is wrapped around. So as the traction feeds your project through, the drum with the sand that's turning allows for a consistent flat surface that you can lower down as you keep needing to sand more of the surface off. So here are 2 views of our finished drum sanded project over at our friend's shop before taking it home. So once we brought our project home, we started doing our hand sanding. Just like the drum sander, hand sanding definitely took a lot of time, and looking back on it, I realized that I kind of went overboard on how much sanding I did. I brought the wooden parts of my project up to about 800 grit, and then the actual epoxy section of our project up to 1500 grit. And if I was to do it again, I definitely would not go as high, just because once you are going to do the seal and flood coat, you don't need as much of a high polish sanding, because you're often going to need to roughen up the surface with about a 220 grit anyway. The high level of sanding that I did leading up to that didn't really make a lot of sense, so if I was to do it again, like I said, I would definitely not go as intense with bringing up the grit. Here's my good friend Bella coming to take a quick look at all the work that I've done up to this point. Here you can see that I put a slight angle on the front of my piece to kind of lessen the sharpness of it. So in the front, I actually did a 7-degree taper, and what I'm doing here is just sanding it to make sure that there's a nice smooth round over, so that when the final finished product comes to be, there isn't going to be such a sharp edge to the front of the table. With the 1500 grit wet sanding that I did in my epoxy, you can really start to see the underlying structure. After the drum sander was done, it really kind of fogged up the surface, and it didn't give that same shine like the original deep pour epoxy had shown through. So once we got to the stage where we were able to do our wet sanding with such a high grit, there was a really crystal clear quality that was showing through and really gave us an idea of how the finished product, once the sealing and flood coat was going to be done, what the project was going to look like, and we were really excited about that. So we found after some of the sanding that there was a couple voids that had grooves, some epoxy that didn't actually cover everything. So what we did here is, after we did the sanding, we brushed out a couple of those spots and then did a quick set epoxy to kind of fill in those voids so that there was a nice flat surface for us to actually use our flood coat for. So I had to share the torture of hand sanding, not only with myself, but I recruited my girlfriend to help me with kind of getting some of this project finished up. While the quickset epoxy did a decent job in doing what we wanted it to do, it's definitely something that if I was to look back on, I probably would have just skipped this step because we weren't able to get it completely flat with our project. So here was one of the most satisfying parts of the whole sanding process. I was able to come through after we sanded down the quickset epoxy that we used to get it to be nice and flat with the rest of the tabletop. The bad thing about this though, and it's a little tip that I can kind of bestow upon anybody that's watching this and kind of getting some ideas for if they want to do an epoxy project in the future. And what I did is with this sandpaper, I actually used a block of wood to kind of give me some extra force to allow myself to get a nice efficient sand. However, if you're going to do this, make sure that the block is smaller than your actual sandpaper size. So what I found was when I was actually going through at the high level to get my epoxy to be nice and polished at this stage, I realized that the block was a little oversized, and it actually made a couple deep gouges that I needed to come through and really go through once again and kind of work up my sandpaper again. So to prevent that from happening, definitely if you're going to use a block to give yourself a little extra friction on the sandpaper, make sure that the sandpaper itself is bigger than that block, or you don't have any holes that allow for the wood to poke through and potentially kind of gouge your project. If you haven't already, like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications for my new videos. Also comment below with any questions with the build, and if you have or plan to work with epoxy for any upcoming projects. So after I finished the top surface to get it nice and flat, smooth, and ready for the ceiling and flood coats, I moved on to the edges and kind of did the same process. This is a little bit different than what I did with the top coats because you also needed to do a little bit of a round over. So I didn't actually use a router like a lot of people do on their tables. I actually just used some sandpaper to kind of give myself a slight round over of the piece on the edges to make sure they weren't so sharp like they were at the beginning after we cut them with the table saw. In the description, you can find a list of links for all the materials used in this video and for the build. So here you can definitely tell that I was pretty ecstatic once I figured that the sanding portion of this project was over, at least for this top, and I kind of threw in the towel and was thankful that we could finally move on to the ceiling and flood coat. So thank you guys for stopping in and watching this sanding portion of this project. So this is going to be part 2, this step-by-step guide for sealing and then doing your flood coat for your epoxy or tabletop. Then after that, I'm actually going to be going into the fabrication of our legs. So those are going to be the next 2 videos of this series before kind of finishing it up. So if you like this kind of content and you want to see more of it, make sure to like, subscribe, and smash that bell for notifications of when my next videos are going to come up. I will see you in the next one. Thanks again. Bye.